1875, an 11-year-old boy was sent into a chimney because his body was small enough to solve a problem adults had created. 15 minutes later, he was stuck inside the wall. The people trying to save him had to break open the brickwork around him, but when they finally pulled him out, it was too late. His name was George Brewster, and he had been ordered to climb inside a narrow flue at a hospital near Cambridge. The strange part is how ordinary the logic behind it was. A chimney was too narrow for a grown man, so a child was sent instead. A mine tunnel was too low for an adult body, so children were sent underground. A machine needed small hands near moving parts, so children stood beside it for hours. At some point, the question stops being only what happened to these children. It becomes something much harder to answer. What made adults keep sending them back? What made a child's small body feel like an acceptable solution to an adult problem, even when everyone could see the danger was real? That is why the Industrial Revolution is one of the most disturbing answers to the question of the worst time in history to be a child. Children became useful in exactly the ways they should have been protected. In 1832, a former factory child named Matthew Crabtree gave evidence to a British parliamentary committee. When he was asked how old he had been when he first went to the mill, his answer was 8. When he was asked how long the day lasted, the answer was worse, from 6 in the morning until 8 at night, with an hour at noon. Try to sit with that without turning it into a statistic. A child young enough to lose baby teeth was already living inside a 14-hour workday. The day began before many children today would even be awake, and it ended so late that there was almost nothing left of the child except tiredness. Inside a textile mill, the machine did not care how old the worker was. It only cared that the thread moved, the work continued, and the room kept producing. A child who became tired was not a child who needed rest in the eyes of the system. He was treated as a slow worker, a careless worker, and a problem inside the pace of production. That is where the goal becomes painfully clear. The child was not trying to have a meaningful childhood. He was trying to keep up with the machine long enough to avoid punishment, keep the wage, and leave the building with his body still whole. The obstacle was not one villain standing in the doorway. The obstacle was the entire arrangement. The family needed the money. The owner needed cheap labor. The factory needed speed. The adult world needed cloth, profit, and growth. The child stood in the middle of all of it, too young to control the system and too useful for the system to leave alone. And once factories proved that small hands could be useful beside machines, the mines showed something even worse. A small body could be useful in places where an adult body did not belong. In coal mines, some children worked as trappers, sitting in darkness beside ventilation doors and opening them when carts passed through. It sounds almost simple until you imagine the child alone underground, waiting in the dark for hours, listening for movement, knowing that the door mattered because the mine needed air to breathe. Other children worked as hurriers, pushing or dragging coal through low tunnels. In some places, the passages were so cramped that the work forced children down onto hands and knees, moving through the earth like the mine had swallowed them, and then asked them to keep working. Here again, the goal was small because the world had made it small. Open the door at the right time. Pull the load far enough. Keep moving through the dark. Do not collapse before the shift ends. And here again, the obstacle was not only danger, it was the cold business logic of the mine itself. The mine needed coal moved through spaces shaped for extraction, not for childhood. Children could fit, and because they could fit, adults found reasons to keep using them. At this point, the answer to the earlier question starts to become clearer. Adults kept sending children back because the work had been divided into pieces that made the responsibility easier to ignore. The family saw the wage, the owner saw the labor, the customer saw the cheaper cloth, the warm room, or the clean fireplace. The law moved slowly behind all of them, arriving after the damage had already become routine. Nobody had to stand over the whole system and admit what it was doing. Each person could look at one small part of it and say they had a reason. That is what made it so hard to stop. By the time this logic reached the chimneys, the child was no longer beside the machine or under the ground. The child was being sent into the wall. A chimney was a practical problem. Soup built up inside narrow flues. Fires had to burn. Homes had to function. And the passage was often too tight for an adult to climb. So the solution became a child known as a climbing boy, someone small enough to disappear into the black space and scrape the inside clean. George Brewster's death showed that logic in its clearest form. The danger was known, but the job still had to be done, and his body was treated as the way to do it. After he became trapped, Rescuers broke through the wall to reach him. The image is almost too clear. Society had to literally open the wall before it could see the child inside. His death helped push stronger enforcement against the use of climbing boys, but the timing is part of what makes the story so hard to sit with. Britain had already seen campaigns against the practice. Laws had already tried to stop children being sent into chimneys. People already knew enough to be ashamed, but not enough to end it quickly. The reforms that followed mattered, although they also revealed what had been tolerated for far too long. Factory laws, mine investigations, and chimney sweep laws did not appear out of nowhere. They came after testimony, pressure, injuries, deaths, and the slow public realization that ordinary work had been taking extraordinary things from children. A law limiting child labor sounds like progress, and it was. At the same time, it forces a darker thought into the open. Before the limit existed, there had been people arguing about where the limit should be. That may be the most unsettling part of this story. There was a time when adults were not debating whether children should have a protected childhood in the way we understand it now. They were debating how many hours were too many, how young was too young, and how dangerous a job had to become before the line was finally crossed. So the worst time in history to be a child was not only the time when children suffered, it was the time when their suffering could be organized into a workday, defended as necessity, softened by habit, and hidden behind the comfort it gave everyone else. Once a child becomes useful to adults, adults can become frighteningly good at explaining why the child has to go back.